Welcome to this video presentation of the talk which was delivered to Killiney Historical Society by John Martin on the 6th of March 2024. First of all, I'd like to give you just a very quick background overview of the Killiney Historical Society. The Society was formed only recently, back in October last year, and really came on the back of an initiative from the Killiney Village Residents Association, which had previously put together a very well received exhibition in 2015 on the history of Killiney Village, which was called Looking Back at Killiney. So developing on from that, we now have the newly formed Killiney Historical Society, and we meet on the first Tuesday of every month, and we plan to have talks every second meeting. So every 2 months we'll be having talks similar to what we're having on now in this presentation. John is a retired town planner, has lived in Dalkey since 1983, and a local historian researching the history of Dalkey with a view to publishing a book in due course. The talk which John is about to give appears in the current edition of History Ireland, which is available to purchase in all good bookshops. So I'll now pass over to John, and we look forward to the talk. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to see such a big audience here tonight. Just to first of all thank Michael and the Society for the invitation. I'm very grateful to Michael for many ways. As he said, I've been working on the local history of Dalkey for the past couple of years, since COVID in fact, and we have a small little group that meets in Dalkey Library, and Michael is a stalwart of that. He's been exceptionally generous in sharing his very extensive knowledge, his maps and diagrams, and including some for tonight's presentation. I should say too that Michael's website, and particularly the YouTube video on Robert Warren and his estate, are the essential backdrop to tonight's talk, because I'll just be focusing in on the Queenstown development, but as you'll see, that's really part of a much bigger picture of Warren's estate. As Michael said, I'm a retired town planner, and I started off by doing the Dungarvan Historic Towns Atlas, which is my mother's hometown. And that I found was a fantastic experience, because it really grounded me in where to find the sources for local history, and I've been trying to apply that now to the Dalkey area. The Atlas came out in 2020, just as COVID lockdown started, and Mary and I were cocooning at the time, literally in the house for the first 2 or 3 months of lockdown, and I decided I'd start writing up the history of Dalkey, and as Michael said, with the view to hopefully in time publishing a book. In fact, it was that research that led me on to tonight's topic of Queenstown, because I was doing some research around the area of Collymore Harbour, and I came across this name Queenstown, Queenstown Castle in particular, which was one of the buildings that Martin Burke and his son James Milo Burke built. The two Burkes were one of the first developers in Dalkey. They moved in the 1830s, and they bought up land very cheaply from the squatters and turned a very handsome profit by building very big houses for wealthy people who were coming out from Dublin, merchants and professional people and so forth. Anyway, one of them was called Queenstown Castle, and just in the nature of things, I was Googling, I think, or searching in the British newspaper archive and other sources, just this word Queenstown, and the image that you'll see shortly, Haverty's image of the Queenstown new town, came up. I came across a brief reference to it in Peter Pearson's book, but I was absolutely intrigued and I wanted to learn more about it. So hence tonight's talk and the article, as Michael said, in History Ireland. Many people, as you know, go up to the viewing point, walking up the hill from the tea rooms on Killiney Hill Park, that lovely viewing point over Killiney Bay down towards Bray and the mountains. And I think most people would have no idea that something like the development that you see on the left-hand side there, which is Haverty's picture of the proposed development, had been envisaged in 1840. Had it gone ahead, I think it would have radically transformed both this side of the hill, and of course the development swept around on the west side of the hill as well, just beneath the obelisk, right over towards Killiney Castle, which was Warren's own home. In my talk tonight, I'll be looking at how this development started, who was promoting it, and particularly why it failed, because I think that there are, even though it doesn't exist, the reasons that it didn't proceed are interesting in themselves, and there's some historical parallels that I'll be talking about in that connection. This is a little video that Michael has given me, so it's a flyover really of the site, and I think it gives you a marvellous view of the kind of terrain that we're talking about, starting there with Telegraph Hill on the Dalkey side, and then moving southwards towards the gap between Dalkey Hill and Killiney Hill. And I think the one thing that will, I'm sure it's very obvious to you and very familiar to you, but the extent of the slopes, the very rocky outcrops, and there's the obelisk, of course, and a lot of it would just have been exactly on these slopes here below the obelisk, coming down towards Vico Road and sweeping around the south side and the west side. So I think that gives you a very good overview of the kind of terrain that was envisaged, and which I think was a major factor in the failure of the project. The story starts in 1834 when Robert Warren, a very wealthy Dublin solicitor, bought the 155-acre Mount Mapus estate. And there had been a building here, and he refurbished it in the kind of castellated style. He came from the Clontarf area, and he also bought a number of properties out there, particularly a house called Baymount, also in the same castellated style. And it wasn't really until 1843 that he moved out here to Killiney Castle. Castellated houses were very much the fashion in Dalkey and the surrounding area, particularly for the nouveau riche. So other examples that we find in that style were Queenstown Castle, the one I mentioned, which was Martin Burke's property near Collymore Harbour, and Castle Park, which is now the school near Bullock, and indeed, of course, Killiney Castle and Baymount Castle. Robert Warren, before he moved out here, had started building some very expensive houses on the side of Obelisk Hill on a new road, which he called Coburg Road, now Vico Road. One of which, the one on the left, he called Victoria Castle, now Asia Castle, I think, and Mount Eagle. I think the picture of Mount Eagle, which is of course an architect's model, is particularly illustrative of the kind of problems of building on the side of a hill such as Killiney Hill, because you can see the massive retaining wall and the earthworks that were required to build a level platform to build a house like Mount Eagle, which would have added enormously to the cost of that house. It is very likely, but not certain, that both of these houses were designed by an architect called Sandham Sines, who I think was either, was he a nephew, Michael, of Warren? Nephew of Robert Warren. And he went on in later life to become architect with the Bank of Ireland, and he designed many bank branches throughout Ireland. The style here is using granite, and particularly the castellated style, but also you remember the archway just below the village here. That was also the entrance to Victoria Castle. This is a slide of Tunbridge Wells in Kent. So around 1840, Robert Warren received a letter from an architect called Valentine Hosking, proposing this new town on the side of Obelisk Hill, and asking Warren if he would be willing to sell the land or to lease it on an agreed price. And Warren responded very quickly that he accepted this in principle. Obviously the price would have to be worked out. Very little is known about Hosking. There is a story, or I came across a record, that he built some houses in Cheltenham in England, which itself, I think interestingly, was a spa town in 1827. Now he claims that he came up with the concept of Queenstown in 1832, which suggests that he had moved from England to Ireland around that time. And he must have had some access to the lands, because he had to work out, how the layout would fit in and so forth. Now, it wasn't a public park in those days, it was private property belonging to Warren. I suspect there had to be some contact between Hosking and Warren before this letter. I don't think it just could have arrived out of the blue. So there may have been some contact between them before that. It is interesting too that Hosking's main concept was that it should be a spa town. And he was very conscious of the success of places like Cheltenham and Tunbridge Wells. Tunbridge Wells as a spa town went back to the 17th century, and it got particularly royal favour in the early Victorian period, when the members of the royal family came down there to stay. And this led to a huge amount of speculative development as wealthier people decided to build homes. And it was this kind of development that I think Hosking felt would be the engine that would drive the Queenstown development. It's not known really where Hosking came from, or even where he worked in the period before 1840. He fell out with Warren 2 years later, and in the insolvency court case, his address was given as Galway, previous addresses Galway, the Isle of Man and Liverpool. And when he wrote to Warren in 1840 proposing the Queenstown development, he gave an address in Eden Quay in Dublin. Now Hosking himself, apart being, as Michael said, an architect and a surveyor, he was an ardent promoter of this scheme, and he came to the various public meetings that were organised, which I'll talk about in a moment, to sell the concept to investors. And he put forward his plans, some sketches that we'll see, and really tried to persuade them that there was huge profits to be made based on experiences like Cheltenham and Tunbridge Wells, where high status, wealthy individuals would buy properties in these spa towns. And I think the image there that you see of Tunbridge Wells, I think, conveys the kind of image that he had in mind, the status that he had in mind. The other thing, and I don't know whether Hoskins knew about this or what stage he knew about it, but there was a spring well somewhere on Killiney Hill, and the water was tested by a very eminent professor called James Apjohn, who was very far from being a quack. He was a very respected scientist and chemist. He actually got the Cunningham Medal, which is the highest award that the Royal Irish Academy can give, in 1837. He analysed the waters from the spring well on Killiney Hill, and comparing them with published analysis of waters at Tunbridge Wells, he said they were almost identical in composition, very, very strong in iron. salts, which apparently had great medicinal qualities. The only problem with his analysis is that he didn't, from what I see anyway, the only summaries of his reports were published at these various meetings. He didn't seem to give any figures as to the rate of flow from the spring. In other words, what were the quantities of water? Would it have really sustained a commercial spa like Tunbridge Wells? That is a map from 1907, and it does show a well on the side of Killiney Hill. You can find it by walking down from the obelisk to the path just behind Holy Trinity Church. And just very close to the path, you'll see the stonework. Now, I don't know whether that is a spring or not, but just from the stonework, it was a very elaborate structure. So it is just a possibility that was the source of it. So Hosking wrote to Warren, proposed this idea, which was accepted in principle. And Warren accepted the idea, but even he was a fairly wealthy man, as he carried out developments both in Clontarf, Victoria Castle, Monteagle and so forth. But a scheme like this was obviously clearly beyond the resources of one man. So a public meeting was held in Dublin in 1840. It was a fairly prestigious meeting. It was chaired by the Lord Mayor at the time. And there were some very prominent speakers at the meeting, one of whom was Martin Burke, the man I've talked about as one of the early developers of Dalkey, but better known as the founder of the Shelbourne Hotel. So a very prominent businessman in his own right. Another of the speakers, again from the Dalkey area, was Dr. Richard MacDonald, who was then a Fellow of Trinity and was later become the Provost of Trinity. And he too, like Martin Burke, I don't know how a clergyman like that came out to Dalkey in the 1830s, again bought up land from squatters, particularly on Sorrento Hill, Sorrento Terrace area. And we'll see what members of his family did with that land. Burke was particularly strong in his support of the proposal. He said it was an ideal site for building a spa town, and he agreed with Hosking that it would attract wealthy investors and possibly even wealthy visitors, wealthy residents from England. Hosking again made the case that this was a very likely successful commercial project, that if based on English experience, Tunbridge Wells and so forth, that if people were prepared to put their money into it, and based on his plans, he was fairly certain there would be a good return for money. And of course, Professor Apjohn's chemical analysis of the water from the spring well was also tabled in support of developing a spa town. Now, Warren himself, for some reason, wasn't at the meeting, but he was represented, I think, by a lawyer called Hawkins, who said that Warren was agreeable in principle to sell 120 acres of his estate that were needed for this proposed site, or to lease it for 900 years. So the meeting agreed to set up a provisional committee that would take the whole project to the next stage, and it included Martin Burke, Arthur Perrin, who I mentioned, who was the previous Lord Mayor of Dublin, and the current Lord Mayor, the present Lord Mayor, the Lord Mayor at the time of the man who chaired the meeting. And it was also suggested at the meeting that the interests of the Dublin and Queenstown Railway would be very relevant as well. At that stage, they were proposing, in fact, maybe carrying out the preliminary works of developing the atmospheric railway from then Kingstown, Dunleary to Dalkey to Barnhill Road. And of course, it was very much in their minds that the railway would be continued from Dalkey round the bay down to Bray and possibly on down to Wexford. But they felt that the railway company, from a purely commercial point of view, would be very interested in having a development like this so close to the projected line. So plans were drawn up by Hosking and published, and he proposed something like 103 separate buildings or individual sites. These were houses, detached houses, or rural houses as they were called, but there were also to be something like 80 terraced housing, making up about 180 plus 2 hotels, public baths, pump room, grottos, public spaces, roads and so forth. There were to be over 3 miles of roads just within the estate, and that of course included what was then called Coburg Road, now Vico Road, because it provided access to Victoria Castle and Mount Eagle. It's interesting that the roads within the estate were called, are proposed to be called, Victoria Road, Albert Road and Royal Crescent. Now these possibly reflected Warren's own political dispositions, but in a way too they might have been intended to attract British investor interest. The frontages of the different sites varied considerably. Some were as small as 25 feet wide, others for the very large houses were 110 feet. So you could see they intended accommodating a whole variety of different house types. There was to be various pleasure gardens as well, and 4 miles of footpaths. So the plans and particulars were available to be inspected in the company's offices in Dame Street, at Sandham Symes, the architect's office in Leinster Street, and in a solicitor's office in Bloomsbury Square in London. It was very interesting that Hosking's own Dublin office was not one of the listed venues. One of the terraces, and Michael is probably better qualified to talk about this than I am, was extraordinarily long. It was, I think, 37 separate dwellings in a single line. Now, there was nothing like that anywhere in the locality. But a few years later, Hercules MacDonald, who was the son of Richard MacDonald, the Provost of Trinity that I mentioned, he built, or he was caused to have built, 8 houses at Sorrento Terrace. Now, in fact, again, I would defer to Peter Pearson's book on this. That scheme had originally been intended to be 22 houses, but was scaled back. And even the 8 houses were built in a kind of a piecemeal fashion, one at a time, as clients were found. They all obviously had to build to the same overall design. Those are the plans there, and the interesting thing is that what is now Sorrento Hill Park was originally intended as the private open space for the houses. And also you can see here too, I think, that for all the rocky hill just behind Sorrento Hill, the actual site of the terrace is fairly level, though I'm not sure how they would have fitted in 22 houses. So the Provisional Committee went ahead and developed this much more detailed prospectus, which was intended to go out to the market and seek investors. And notices were published in the newspapers in June 1841 inviting people to subscribe. And it was fairly detailed. I mean, the whole thing took about 1.5 columns of small print in the newspapers, and they presented the various costings, likely financial return and so forth. So the total cost that they expected to lay out was £140,000, which is a lot in those days, because if you multiply that, I suppose, maybe by 30 or 40 to get a modern equivalent. One of the biggest sums within that overall figure was $35,000 that was to be paid to Warren for the land cost. There was a $51,000 for building just some of the terraced houses and 8 villas. The idea was the company itself would build and sell some of the bigger houses. Otherwise, they would just sell sites, and people then, like Sorrento Terrace, would build in accordance with their overall plans. And they had $20,000 for building roads and £19,000 for waterworks. The prospectus went on. If you don't mind, I'll just read this bit, because I think it reflects Hosking's vision and what he thought was the motivation for having it here. The want of a first-rate watering place in the vicinity of the metropolis has long been the surprise of visitors. While so many towns of similar description have been established within a few years in England and other countries, in other words, he was thinking about places like Cheltenham and Tunbridge Wells, on sites very inferior to the ones selected for Queenstown, and with great profit to the shareholders. It is presumed from the want of such an establishment and the very high rent obtained for building ground and houses in the vicinity, that a very large profit will accrue to the shareholders in the purchase of the estate, the formation of roads and pleasure grounds, the selling or leasing of frontage for building, and carrying out the whole design by a building company. This is one of the plans that was tabled by Hosking. If we just step up here, but just to orient yourselves, that is the obelisk. So you can see that the proposed development sweeps round from Killiney Castle, which is there on the top right, on the west side of the hill, south side, and then coming round facing east, Killiney Bay. So there's, as you can see, there's a series of individual houses. The long black lines are the proposed terraces, and the one I was talking about with 37 different sites is the one just below the obelisk, and there are smaller ones then just coming down towards Telegraph Hill. So that is the scheme that was presented to the potential investors at the public meeting. This is a picture, a painting, which was engraved by Joseph Haverty. Haverty was a fairly well-known painter at the time, RHA. He mainly specialised in landscapes and in portraits. Apparently, I haven't seen it, but apparently did a very fine portrait of Daniel O'Connell. So I suspect this was a commercial proposition that it's obviously based on the plans that you've just seen. There's the huge terrace just below the obelisk. And what you can't see, of course, is the development sweeping around the hill. So there's, again, there's more of it on the west side, on the Killiney Castle side. But I think that's a very striking image, and that was presented at the public meeting to attract interest. And attached on the graving, it said, this was designed and arranged by Messrs. Hosking and Son. So it was always Hosking's claim, and indeed Warren himself acknowledged it, that it was Hosking's idea, not Warren's idea, to develop a speculative proposal like this. So in summary, the kind of financial proposition that was put to potential investors was that Warren would sell or lease the site for $35,000, but in return he would reinvest $10,000 of that money in shares in the building company. In the hope of attracting maybe some smaller investors, the shares would be pitched at £10 each, and there would be 15,000 of those. So people obviously could buy multiples of them, but so the capital would be 150,000, which, looking at it, is actually only slightly more than the capital cost that they estimated of 140,000. So you just wonder about the prudence of that. There was very little margin. Anybody who bought 100 of these shares would be entitled to be a director of the company, and they could pretty well choose a site from the plans if they wanted to build their own house. As I said, the total estimated costs, at least those fronted up by the company, were 140,000. People who went on to buy sites, they would have to pay the company further monies towards the cost of development. And it was pointed out, just again to encourage investors, that Warren was making a fairly nice return in terms of rents from some of the houses that he'd already built, such as Victoria Castle and Mount Eagle. So this was, again, figured in as part of the potential returns to investors that they could expect, the kind of rents that they would get from these very prestigious villas and terraces to be built on Obelisk Hill. But things went off the rails very, very quickly indeed after the public meeting and the publication of the prospectus. Shortly before the prospectus was published, the directors of the Provisional Committee resolved that once the share list had been published and people started putting their names down, they wouldn't actually have to pay anything up front until about half of the money, which is £70,000, had been subscribed. At that stage, a further general meeting would be called, and they would actually formally set up the building company that would carry out the development works. So this provisional committee employed Hosking for a period of about 6 months in 1841 after the public meeting, at which he was supposed to do further detailed designs, cost estimates and so forth. And he was paid £6 a week during that 6-month period. And it would appear that this money was paid by Warren himself, because the company itself had no money at that stage. But at the end of the 6-month period, he was let go, or they threatened to cancel they wouldn't continue paying him at that rate. And he in return said he wasn't going to hand over his plans and drawings. So they took action against him in the courts, declared him to be insolvent. And that case is very interesting because the company secretary admitted that the whole project had been a complete failure. They hadn't, in fact, attracted any money at all. The company had ceased to operate. Hoskins agreed to hand over his plans to the court for the benefit of his creditors, whoever they were, and not just Warren. And he seems to have vanished from the scene, whether he went back to England. But there's no record, apparently, of him operating a Dublin office after that time. So I think there are several reasons why Queenstown failed as a project. The first reason is that it clearly failed as a commercial proposition to attract the kind of investments needed. I think it's striking, for example, that neither Martin Burke nor Richard MacDonald, who had spoken very vigorously at the public meeting, appeared to put any money of their own money into the project. If you remember too, this was the years just before the famine. There was a relatively small pool of wealthy professional people in Dublin who had money to spare for investments. And even those people had many, many other opportunities for investing their money. A good example of where they could have invested, and which a successful commercial proposition, were the various railways. Because as I said, the Dublin and Kingstown Railway, that had been operating a conventional steam rail to to Dunleary up from 1834 onwards, was in the process of running, or would be shortly running, the atmospheric railway to Dalkey, and was well known they had plans to extend it to Bray and onwards. And indeed, when it did come, and again Michael would know a lot more about this, the line went at the very base of Vico Road there around Obelisk Hill, and for a brief time there was a station which Warren insisted on called Obelisk Hill Station, just for a couple of years. I also think that another big reason for the failure of the scheme, and I don't know to what extent this would have been picked up by people at the time, but even if it had been commercially successful, even if they could have attracted the investments, the gradients I think were not realistic. Now, they actually got a report from a man called Barry Gibbons, who was one of the engineers at the new Kingstown Harbour, and I think he gave a very carefully worded statement. I have examined the sections, these are the lengths of measuring the gradient on roads, under Mr. Hosking's direction. Assuming these sections and the calculations to be correct, they afford sufficient information to make an estimate of the cost, i.e. 20,000. The problem with that very qualified statement is that the sections that he was talking about referred to long sections along the road and not cross sections up and down the hill, because you might have been able to build the roads, but it would have been extremely costly to build houses on either side of those roads. And again, you only have to think back to the image I showed you of Mount Eagle and the kind of supporting works that were needed if you're building houses on a slope like that. And no details of the cross sections were provided at the meeting. So I think in engineering terms, it was a highly unrealistic scheme. And that's borne out, I think, by the Ordnance Survey map. The shading there, and just to orient you, that's the obelisk. The shading, particularly on the Killiney Bay side, you can just see how dramatic it is. And I think, and you can also see Vico Road and Mount Eagle. Building houses on the obelisk side of Vico Road, I think, was just never a realistic proposal. It looks to be a bit flatter on the west side, sort of coming down from Killiney Castle, but not on the east side. There were several other problems, I think, practical problems that actually building the scheme would have encountered had it gone ahead. It was customary at that time in the 1840s and 1830s, when the first houses were being built, big houses in Killiney Dalkey area, that the individual houses would have relied to a very great extent on private wells and pumps to pump the water up to them. It's worth remembering that a public water supply from the Vartry Reservoir didn't really come into this area until 1870. And even then, certainly as far as the Dalkey Town Commissioners were concerned, they had great problems in getting sufficient water pressure up to the houses on higher ground, such as Torquay Road, and they had to do things like pumping the water up to those higher houses. So that, I think, would have been a huge practical problem for the houses on Obelisk Hill as well. I just don't know how they could have provided a water supply for something like 1,000 people. If you take all of those houses, 180 houses, that's 4 or 5 people per house, and 2 hotels, I think you'd very quickly get the guts of 1,000 people resident on the site. The other problems, again, there were no details of how they would provide for sewerage, because a private company would have lacked any of the kind of statutory powers that the town commissioners had, and the Killiney Town Commissioners weren't established until 1866. They would have had powers of compulsory purchase, for example, if they were laying sewers. So again, I don't know how, in public health terms, a scheme like Queenstown would actually have worked. What I find very surprising is that despite the very abject failure, and I don't think there's any other way of describing it, the abject failure of the proposal, Warren himself seems to have retained some lingering hope that it might go ahead, even as late as 1845, several years afterwards, because he published this ad. The print is fairly small, so maybe I'll read it out to you. To be let, Victoria Castle, Albert Castle, Kent Lodge, sees us in the big houses on Vico Road. Varied private enclosed pleasure grounds of great extent on which Queenstown is proposed to be built. The proprietor, I. Warren, of this rising and very valuable property, on which there are numerous splendid building sites, would sell the entire thereof with all the buildings and improvements. And he also went on to refer to the iron-rich spring wells, the medical virtues of which are equal to the celebrated spa at Tunbridge Wells. So over time after the 1841 Queenstown project, Warren, and again I'm grateful to Michael and the video that he has on the Warren estate, Warren went on to continue this kind of speculative development, particularly in the Foxrock and Galloping Green area. But I think he wasn't a good businessman in the sense that he tended to spend too much money on projects, not really thinking about whether they would make a financial return or that. And as he got more and more into financial difficulty, it became increasingly difficult to deal with, and attempted to sue various people, and dealt very aggressively with the railway company when they were trying to buy land, buy the route for the railway through his land. He himself died in 1869, and his memorial is in the Killiney Hill church, and the estate passed to his son Robert Warren Jr. But unfortunately, the debts that his father had piled up, especially around Fox Rock and Galloping Green, they were called in, and there weren't sufficient resources in the Warren estate to pay off these, because he had very, very extensive liabilities. So there was something called the Landed Estates Court, which I suppose was a bit like NAMA of the day, and they decided that the only way of settling these debts was to sell Warren's estate at Killiney. But they were successful in selling off Victoria Castle for £5,000, and this, together with some other resources, allowed Warren Jr. to settle with the main creditors, and the remaining properties, part of the estate, were withdrawn from the auction. I mentioned that Warren Sr., Robert Warren, was very aggressive and hard to deal with. And he took the view that Vico Road, which was then a private road from the village here, the gateway, right round to this house there called St. German's on one side and Sunnyside. And you can see very clearly from the photograph, particularly that Michael has sent me, that the road was blocked, physically blocked, almost on a different alignment for about 30 or 40 years. And I had mentioned earlier on Richard MacDonald, who was the Provost of Trinity and the original owner of the lands at Sorrento Terrace. He came under an awful lot of pressure from people in the Dalkey area who would have liked to continue, because Vico Road was open from the Dalkey side up as far as the houses there called St. German's and Sunnyside, and there was tremendous public campaigns to open the road at this point and continue right round towards Killiney. It is, as we all know, an immensely scenic road, and there were little businesses operating. For example, Jarvis would meet the trains at Ducky Station and bring people on. So Richard MacDonald actually went to the trouble of posting a notice on the wall there near Sunnyside, saying that it was his wish that the road would be opened, and this was in 1863, and that he had tried to negotiate with Warren to open the road, but Warren had absolutely refused. So that continued past Warren's death, and it was only in the 1880s that the road was opened. And the other person, of course, who objected very strongly to the opening of the road was Clifford Lloyd. He was the man who had paid £5,000 to buy Victoria Castle, and he thought that the bit of road outside us here from Victoria Castle up to the gateway was his private access. And Michael has shown me a photograph of the gateway with actual gates and a very large sign saying no trespassers. So their opposition really had to be overcome before the road could be opened. Eventually Robert Warren himself sold most of the land that now forms Killiney Hill Park for, again, another £5,000, and it was opened in 1887 and dedicated as a public park. And the outcome of that is that all of us now can walk up to the park and enjoy the kind of views that would have been completely privatised had the Queenstown scheme gone ahead. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I'd just like to thank John for tonight's talk, which was most enlightening, and the depth of research there really shines through, John. There was
Thank you, Michael.
an awful information that I've never come across before, and I'd be very excited to follow up on a lot of the stories you brought to our attention tonight. I suppose in particular, one thing that struck me was the discovery of the mineral water up on the hill.
Yes.
And there's this notion that there could be a bottled water in Killiney, and if things had gone ahead,
yes.
who knows where we'd be.
Could I ask, does anybody know anywhere else where that spring might be other than the well that I showed? Is there any other sign of a spring up there? No? I don't know who discovered the spring. I suspect Hosking must have known about it, because that really fed very well into his whole concept of developing a spa town. So there had to be some mineral waters that would have been the basis of that concept.
Yeah. I think you're right, John, where you pointed out the pump house on the hill.
Yes.
That has turned up in other maps as well.
Right.
It's the only well that I've seen evidence of on the hill, so
yes.
that may very well be it.
Yes.
And maybe it's worth some exploration. If any hydrologists out there would like to bring up a drilling rig, I'm sure we'd have to get permission for that. So, John, just one question for you.
Yeah.
You know you've looked at it in a lot of detail. What is your opinion in terms of the overall design of the development, and would you have been in favour of it going ahead now in hindsight?
I think it was completely the wrong location. It might have worked on more level ground. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, squares were being developed in Dublin City, in Queenstown, that Peter Pearson has talked about in his book on Queenstown. But these were relatively level ground. I think it never stood a chance on a sloping site like this. Yeah. I also wondered too whether that amount of demand, like 180 houses, was a huge amount to release. I mean, if you look at the difficulties that Hercules MacDonald had in the houses on Sorrento Terrace, only 8, and they were built one at a time, to release 180 onto the market in the years coming up to the famine, I just wonder about it.
Yeah. No, I think we're all thankful for that. I mean, even as you pointed out, one of the terraces alone there was 5 times the size of Sorrento Terrace.
Yes.
So you can imagine 2 blocks, each 5 times the size of Sorrento Terrace on Killiney Hill, plus all the other freestanding houses. It's going to be some incredible scream on it.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'd like to just throw to the floor. If there's any questions for John, please feel free to